My grandmother told me something during the last clear day before she died, before the stroke took her words and left just the shapes of them behind. She said every household along the Cossatot River kept one rule for generations. Not written down, not something you taught openly. Just something your parents told you when you were old enough to understand. Something that hung in the air of the valley like seasonal weather, taken for granted by everyone who lived there and completely invisible to anyone passing through. The rule was simple. You fed them. Whatever they were, whoever they were, some part of your hunt went to the deep forest. Some portion of your stores went to marked places. You maintained the feeding, or the feeding would stop. And when the feeding stopped, the valley changed. I am telling you this story because my family's time along the Cossatot River is ending. The land is being sold, the old place is being cleared for a resort development, and the people who hold the knowledge are dying. My grandmother was the last of the core witnesses. My mother knew the outline of it, but never understood the weight. I am somewhere in between, old enough now to grasp what my grandmother was trying to tell me, too late to ask the clarifying questions that would make it coherent. But I have journals. I have the oral accounts she recorded on a cassette tape in 1989. I have what she was able to write down before her mind went. And I have the place itself, the valley, the offering sites, the locations that have been marked and maintained for longer than anyone can prove, but everyone who lived there understood. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about Dogman doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called the Dogman Codex. If you ever want more, it's linked below. Either way, let's get into the story. The Cossatot River Valley in Arkansas is not famous. It does not have the mythological weight of the Smoky Mountains or the cultural recognition of Appalachian hollers. It runs through Polk County and Howard County, through terrain that is steep, heavily forested, and carved up by limestone bluffs and deep ravines. The river itself is beautiful in a way that requires effort to appreciate. The kind of beauty that only reveals itself if you spend time moving through it, understanding its seasonal rhythms, respecting what lives there. The valley was settled by logging families in the 1880s and 90s, people who came to harvest timber, and then, when the immediate profit ran out, stayed because they had nowhere else to go. And the land, despite its difficulty, was capable of supporting subsistence. My family on my father's side, the Merrill line, arrived in 1892 after the first wave of logging had already depleted the easiest timber. They bought land that the timber companies had written off as marginal, 43 acres of rocky hillside, alongside a tributary that fed the Cossatot proper. The land was nearly worthless, which meant my great-grandfather could afford it. He and his wife built a structure that was part cabin, part foundation for future expansion, and they began the work of convincing an isolated and difficult landscape to support human habitation. By the time my grandmother was born in 1917, the Merrill family had been in the valley for 25 years. They had expanded the original structure, cleared and maintained pasture land, established a small orchard, developed relationships with the other families that had settled the valley. They were not wealthy, but they were established, and they understood, by that point, the protocols that governed living in that particular place. My grandmother was born in 1917, which means she carried in her bones the memory of a world that had already changed twice and was changing again. Her mother, my great-grandmother Eleanor, had been born in 1895, which meant Eleanor was old enough to remember the world before the automobiles, before the electric lights reached the valley, before the outside world began pressing in on the isolated spaces where people could maintain their own rules and their own understandings. My grandmother inherited from Eleanor not just the practical knowledge of how to maintain the offerings, but the deeper understanding that the offerings were a form of respect, a recognition that the valley was not entirely human territory and never had been. My grandmother kept a diary, separate from the official journals that recorded when offerings were left and where. This diary was personal, reflective, and filled with observations about the changing nature of the valley and her growing awareness of what her family was actually maintaining. In one entry from 1951, when she was 34 years old and had already been maintaining the offerings for nearly a decade, she wrote something that I return to often. I asked my mother today if she was ever afraid of them. She said, "Fear is for people who don't understand an arrangement. Once you understand that an arrangement exists, that it benefits both parties, that it is maintained by mutual consent, fear becomes irrelevant. What replaces fear is responsibility. You become the person who maintains the boundary between two worlds, and that is a weight that does not diminish with time. My grandmother married in 1945, taking on the responsibility fully, understanding that she was marrying not just a man but a way of life, a commitment to the valley that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. She had two children, my mother and my uncle. My uncle left the valley in 1968, moved to California, severed his connection to the family protocol almost entirely. My mother stayed. My mother understood, as my grandmother did, that the offering was not optional, that the knowledge was not something you could simply abandon without consequence. My grandmother grew up hearing stories about the valley that were not in any book and would not be shared with outsiders. Stories about the creatures that lived in the deep forest, the areas that were never logged, the places where the trees grew so densely and the terrain was so broken that no person had ever successfully mapped those sections. The creatures were rarely seen. The sightings, when they happened, were handled with a kind of practiced calm that suggested that seeing one was not unusual, merely required specific responses. The oldest instruction Eleanor received was this: if you encountered one of them in the deep forest, you did not run. Running triggered response. If you encountered one near the settled areas, if it crossed the line that separated their territory from human territory, you made yourself visible, made noise, did not threaten. Retreat slowly. Do not show fear. Do not show aggression. The creatures understood the difference between an accidental encounter and an intentional intrusion. Eleanor's father, William Merrill, maintained the offering sites. There were 3 primary locations on their property where the family would leave portions of every hunt. A cleared area about 200 yards into the forest from the house, marked by a specific tree formation. A location along the creek bed, accessible but separate from the places where the family took water. A site deeper in, nearly a mile from the house, in the direction where the forest deepened and the terrain became more rugged. At each location, the family would leave portions of deer or elk, occasionally grain or dried meat from their own stores. Never poison, never anything that suggested aggression or trap. Eleanor wrote about this in a journal she kept beginning in 1935. She had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse that served the valley, a structure that had burned and been rebuilt twice, that was staffed by rotating teachers from town who stayed a few years and then moved to positions where they did not have to live among people who believed in things that were not in books. She wrote in careful script about the pragmatic details of maintaining a household in extreme isolation. But buried in those entries about food preservation and livestock illness and the struggle to keep a propane heater functional were observations about the offerings, the protocols, the understanding she and her family maintained. One entry from 1938 reads, "Had to prepare an offering earlier than usual. Deer population has been scarce. The protocol requires us to maintain portions even when the hunting is poor. Father said we should take from the stores. Mother disagreed until sunset, then agreed. The location was left fresh at midnight. The following morning, the offering had been taken. The ground around the site showed weight impressions, deep and deliberate. Father examined them and said they were recent, within hours. He seemed satisfied." Another entry from 1940. "The deep site has been visited frequently. Father marked a new location because he says the creatures are becoming habituated to the old one. He believes they prefer a location that is further from human travel. He marked a spot he discovered, a natural shelter formed by an overhang of limestone, accessible only by moving through very difficult terrain. He left an offering there with a note. Of course the creatures cannot read," he said, "but I place the note as a message to anyone who might discover it, a record that the offering is placed deliberately, not abandoned. There are accounts in the family journals of direct encounters that go back before Eleanor's documented sighting in 1942. My great-great-grandfather, William Merrill, Eleanor's father, apparently encountered one of the creatures in 1919 during a hunt in the deep forest. He did not leave a detailed written account of this encounter, but he referenced it in a letter to his brother in Pennsylvania. In that letter, he wrote, "I have seen something in this valley that convinced me that the agreement that the earlier residents spoke of is not folklore, but daily reality. I will not commit to writing exactly what I witnessed, but I can say that I understand now why the offerings are maintained and why they must continue. The creature did not threaten me, but it made clear that it was aware of my presence and that it was evaluating whether my presence was acceptable. I believe I passed that evaluation only because we left offerings at the primary site 2 days prior. The implications of this are not something I wish to contemplate. Eleanor was therefore growing up with knowledge that her father had not just heard stories about the creatures, but had encountered one directly. This shaped her approach to the protocol with a kind of reverent seriousness that would characterize her entire life. She approached the offerings not as folklore, but as a responsibility, something that she performed with the understanding that failure could have serious consequences. The journal entries from 1943 and 1944 contain several references to hearing vocalizations at night, sounds that Eleanor could not identify, but that she associated with the creatures. She wrote about these sounds with a kind of mixture of fear and fascination. One entry from June 1943 reads, "Heard them again last night, moving through the forest edge. The sound is not like wolves, not like any animal I have encountered. It carries a quality that seems almost intentional, almost like communication. Williams says they are probably establishing territory markers, letting us know they are present. He does not seem concerned by this. I find the sounds deeply unsettling, but I cannot say whether this is fear or something else entirely." Eleanor's journal entries from the 1940s contain references to hearing sounds at night, vocalizations that her family understood as communication from the creatures, that the creatures had come closer to the house, that the understanding between the Merrill family and whatever lived in the forest was holding, but was subject to variation based on seasons and circumstances. The first direct sighting that Eleanor recorded occurred on a winter morning in 1942. She had gone to one of the offering sites to restock supplies, moving through the deep snow that had accumulated overnight. As she approached the location, she realized there was movement ahead of her. She stopped and waited. What emerged from the tree line was something that her careful handwriting could barely describe. She wrote, "Standing at the boundary where the deep forest meets the cleared land. A creature of significant size, perhaps 7.5 feet in height, covered in dark hair, both brown and black, the color shifting with the light and the movement of the fur. The posture was upright, weight balanced on hind legs, but the forward lean of the torso suggested a natural position somewhere between human and animal. The face was the part I could not reconcile. Not a wolf, not a bear, not anything I have ever encountered in books or in person. The muzzle was pronounced but not extreme. The eyes were what arrested my attention. They were aware, intelligent. They looked at me with what I interpreted as assessment, not predatory but evaluative. Eleanor did not run. She did not raise the rifle she was carrying. She stood very still and waited. The creature watched her for what Eleanor estimated was perhaps 2 minutes, though she noted that her sense of time in that moment was unreliable. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. Eleanor described the gait as peculiar, the hind legs carrying most of the weight, but the front limbs, or arms, moving in a coordinated pattern that suggested purpose beyond simple balance. When it disappeared into the dense forest, Eleanor walked to the offering site and found that the previous day's supply had been consumed, the ground cleaned, the area left neat. What Eleanor wrote after that encounter shaped everything that came after, for her and for me. I do not believe this encounter was accidental. The creature was aware of the offering site. It may have been waiting, it may have arranged to be visible to me as a form of confirmation, an acknowledgement that the protocol was understood by both parties. I am taking this interpretation as significant. I will continue the offerings with renewed attention to detail. The years immediately after the Second World War brought significant change to the valley. The men who had served returned with different perspectives, some of them no longer willing to maintain the protocols that their families had sustained for generations. There was a sense that the outside world was larger, more powerful, more real than the old agreements. Why should people who had fought in Europe and the Pacific defer to protocols established by people who had never left the valley? But the older generation, represented primarily by Eleanor and by several other elderly residents who had lived through earlier periods of doubt and had maintained the arrangements regardless, stood firm. One of the significant moments in the post-war years occurred in 1947 when a young man named Robert Caldwell returned from the war and integrated into the valley community, decided to test the protocols. He violated a primary rule by hunting in the deep forest sections without performing the proper offering preparations first. According to accounts that were later documented by my grandmother, Caldwell returned from that hunt with his equipment damaged, his horse spooked beyond the point of control, and a conviction that he had been deliberately threatened. He did not describe the threat explicitly, but he told Eleanor that he had seen something, that he had understood he was not welcome in that territory, and that he would not be returning to hunt in those sections regardless of his opinions about the protocols. Caldwell participated in maintaining the offerings for the rest of his life, and even became one of the more devoted practitioners of the protocol after that encounter. My grandmother documented this as an example of how the creatures responded to violations without necessarily delivering lethal consequences. The creatures made clear that boundaries existed and that the boundaries would be enforced, but they did not kill or seriously injure someone who violated them once they understood that the person had received the message. The Second World War drew some of the younger men from the valley, including Eleanor's brother. Those who remained tightened their connection to the land, to the protocols, to the understanding that living in the Cossatot Valley required participation in rituals that had no external justification. Eleanor married William Thorne in 1944, and they remained in the valley, taking over more of the responsibility for the offerings as her father aged. The ritual became more formalized. Instead of random portions left at marked sites, Eleanor and William began a systematic rotation. They hunted deliberately with a portion of the kill allocated before the hunt even began. They dried and stored portions specifically for the offerings. They maintained a journal parallel to Eleanor's personal observations, a purely functional record of what was left where and when. This journal was inherited by my mother, who continued it with less poetry but equal accuracy. The entries shift from Eleanor's reflective prose to my mother's clipped observations. Winter, 1954. Left elk hindquarter at the deep site. Also grains and salt stores. The site was cleared within 48 hours. Spring, 1960. Increased offerings due to larger hunting group visiting the valley. The creatures responded by shifting territory markers slightly northward. Suggested boundaries may be adjusting. Through the 1960s and 1970s, a growing generational split began to emerge in the valley. The youngest generation, educated in schools outside the valley, exposed to scientific frameworks, increasingly did not believe in the reality of the creatures or the necessity of the offerings. My mother found herself in the position of defending a protocol that she understood intellectually, but that had begun to feel antiquated, even embarrassing, as she grew into adulthood and began to interact with people from outside the valley who had no reference point for such beliefs. My mother wrote in her journal from 1966, "My sister-in-law, visiting from Little Rock, asked me today what my mother was doing in the forest. I told her it was a family tradition. She asked what kind of tradition. I could not answer her directly. How do I explain to someone from a city, someone educated in universities, someone who does not believe in anything that is not documented in textbooks, that my mother is maintaining an offering site for creatures that may or may not exist, that may or may not be intelligent, but whose existence cannot be denied by my family, because to deny them would be to invite consequences?" I felt foolish. But I understood that my foolishness came from trying to reconcile two different ways of understanding the world, two different frameworks for what is real and what is folklore. This period of doubt and questioning characterized many of the Valley families that maintained the protocol. There were serious discussions about whether the offerings could be discontinued, whether the creatures would respond to modern weapons, whether the agreements had ever actually been real, or whether they were just stories that people had told themselves to make sense of an isolated and difficult environment. But despite the doubt, the offerings continued. None of the families that had maintained the protocol for multiple generations were willing to be the first ones to stop. The cost of being wrong was simply too high. My mother understood the practical reality of the arrangement. The creatures that lived in the valley were intelligent, possibly more intelligent than humans in the ways that mattered for survival in that landscape. They had established a boundary with the human settlements. They were willing to tolerate human presence and activity, at least up to a point, as long as the offerings continued and the protocol was respected. Break the protocol and the boundary would shift. The creatures would make clear that tolerance was no longer being offered, but maintain it, make the offerings, recognize the arrangement, and the creatures would remain in the deep forest and would not interfere with human survival. The deeper history that Eleanor and my mother only partially understood came through my grandmother, who spent years in the later part of her life trying to construct a coherent narrative from fragments of information that had been passed down through her family and through conversations with elderly residents of the valley who still remembered accounts that predated any written records. The arrangement between the Merrill family and the creatures in the forest was not unique. Every significant family in the valley that had survived more than a generation maintained some version of the same protocol. Different families had different offering sites, different traditions around which portions of kills were allocated, different interpretations of what the creatures actually were, but the core understanding was universal. There existed an understanding, and that understanding was contingent on the offerings. My grandmother's efforts to document the Cossatot understanding began in the late 1960s, as she became increasingly concerned that the knowledge was being lost. She was not motivated by academic interest, but by a genuine fear that, when her generation passed, the understanding of the protocol would be fragmentary and incomplete, and the younger generation would not maintain it with the seriousness that it required. She began to visit elderly residents of the valley, people who were in their 80s and 90s, who had been born in the 1880s, who remembered the world before logging had exhausted the accessible timber, before automobiles had begun to reach the valley. The interviews were conducted without recording devices, without formal documentation, just conversations in the homes of old people who were generally reluctant to speak about things that they had been taught never to speak about. My grandmother had to earn their trust, had to convince them that she was not trying to make the accounts into folklore or to use them for purposes beyond preserving family knowledge. One interview with Martha Colvin, conducted in 1971, lasted 7 hours. My grandmother took handwritten notes, transcribing Martha's accounts as accurately as she could, though Martha herself often stopped mid-sentence and said things like, "I shouldn't be telling you this," or, "My mother made me promise not to speak of this except to family." What emerged from these interviews was a picture of the protocol that was more complex and more ancient than what the written record suggested. The agreements had not begun with the logging families. They stretched back further, to indigenous populations that had established the protocols and had maintained them over centuries. The logging families had discovered evidence of the protocols, had learned about them through encounters and through careful attention to the landscape, and had continued them because continuing them was safer than stopping. The protocols represented an understanding that had existed longer than any individual human community in the valley, that might have existed for centuries, possibly longer. Martha Colvin told my grandmother something that my grandmother never fully explained, but that haunted her for the rest of her life. She said, "The creatures remember, not in the way that people remember, forgetting things, changing stories, letting time fade the details. They remember like stones remember, like mountains remember. They remember the first agreements. They remember every offering that was ever left. They remember every person who violated the protocol. They remember every promise that was made. And the older they get, the more they remember. Some of them might be older than the valley itself." My grandmother interviewed residents who had grown up in the valley in the 1880s. An elderly woman named Martha Colvin, who lived to be 94, told my grandmother stories her parents had told her about the original agreement, though Martha herself was vague about the details and seemed uncomfortable describing them explicitly. According to Martha, the agreement predated the logging era. It went back to when the valley was primarily settled by indigenous peoples, though by the time the logging families arrived, the indigenous populations had been displaced or exterminated. But the agreement, Martha said, had transferred somehow. The new inhabitants of the valley, the logging families, had learned about the creatures from traces, from encounters, from instructions left at offering sites, and they had continued the protocol because not doing so would invite retaliation. My grandmother's efforts to create a coherent narrative from these fragments resulted in what she called the Cossatot understanding. This was not an official document, just a manuscript she wrote in 1972, after she had convinced several of the oldest residents of the valley to speak with her about the history they carried. The manuscript was never published, but it was copied and circulated among the valley families who still maintained the protocol. The understanding described the creatures not as animals, but as an independent civilization, one that had established sovereignty over the deep forest and was willing to coexist with human civilization in the valley as long as certain conditions were met. According to my grandmother, the conditions were these: The valley families would leave offerings of meat and grain at designated locations during all seasons. The offerings would be genuine, portion of successful hunts, not refuse or rotten stores. The valley families would maintain boundaries, would not hunt or travel into the deepest forest sections without permission, would not attempt to photograph or document the creatures or their habitats. In return, the creatures would not interfere with human settlements, would not hunt human livestock beyond a sustainable level, would not threaten human lives except in cases of extreme provocation. The arrangement was understood to be contingent. The creatures maintained the boundaries because the offerings continued. If the offerings stopped, the boundaries would not hold. My grandmother spent the last decade of her life worried that the boundaries were already beginning to shift. The valley was changing. People were leaving, finding employment in larger towns, sending their children away to school and not having them return. The logging era had ended, replaced by agriculture and small-scale ranching. But even that was becoming economically marginal. Young people did not want to maintain isolated homesteads, did not want to continue the offering protocols, did not believe that the creatures existed or that the offerings mattered. The valley population was aging. The families who knew the protocol were becoming fewer. When my mother was still living and I would visit the valley, she would sometimes stand at the edge of the property and look northward toward the forested ridge that formed the boundary between settled land and deep forest. She would say things like, "The world is changing faster than it can maintain anything," or, "When I am gone, who will maintain this?" Not because she expected me to answer, but because she was articulating a fear that ran deeper than simple concern about property or family history. She was afraid that the agreement would be broken not through deliberate violation, but through simple erosion, through the gradual withdrawal of attention that characterizes the modern world. The first serious threat to the valley came in the early 2000s, when a venture capitalist from outside the region purchased several large sections of land with the intention of developing a luxury resort. The news circulated through the valley quietly, with a kind of dread that my mother could not articulate, but that shaped every conversation I had with her in that period. She said things like, "They don't understand what they're doing," or, "If they develop the deep forest, everything that has been maintained will be lost." One of the last entries in my grandmother's personal journal, dated 1988, just 2 years before she had a stroke that took her ability to write, reads, "I am the last one who truly understands what the agreement means. My daughter knows the mechanics of it, but not the philosophy. My grandchildren do not believe. When I am gone, the knowledge will persist only as folklore. But the creatures do not know this. They will continue to expect the offerings. And when they do not come, when the protocol fails entirely, the valley will discover what the Cossatot understanding actually cost us." The transition happened gradually and then all at once. Through the 1990s, the valley families continued the offerings, but with less systematic attention, with less conviction, with a growing sense that they were maintaining an antiquated tradition out of habit and superstition rather than genuine necessity. A few families moved away entirely. The offering sites were sometimes neglected for weeks. The younger people who remained in the valley did not participate in the maintenance. The knowledge began to fragment. By 2000, I had left the valley entirely. I had gone to university, developed career interests that took me to cities, married, had children. I visited the old place occasionally, stayed with my parents or mother for a few days, and then returned to my life outside the valley. I was aware of the offering tradition as a family oddity, something that my parents still maintained, but that I did not seriously believe in, and certainly did not participate in. I had been educated, had been exposed to rational frameworks for understanding the world, and the idea of feeding creatures in the forest seemed like folklore, something my family did because it was habitual, not because it was necessary. I went back to visit in October of 2004. My mother was still living in the old house. My father had passed 6 years earlier, and she had considered selling the place, but it was worth very little on the market, and she had family history to the land that went too deep to sever. She asked me to help with some repairs on the house and to assist with the fall offerings. I did it perfunctorily, hunting elk with my mother, bringing down an old bull that had been on the property, and then, at her direction, preparing portions for the offering sites. My mother was matter-of-fact about the procedure. We packed the meat into coolers, we drove to the primary offering site along the creek, and we left the portions in the marked location. She explained the reasoning carefully. The creatures preferred fresh offerings, but the location was sufficiently remote that Predation by other animals was unlikely if the offerings were left early enough in the evening. She had calculated that a one-day lag time between kill and offering was acceptable. More than that, she said, and the quality of the meat degraded in ways that the creatures would interpret as disrespectful. I asked her directly, "Do you actually believe that there are creatures here that respond to offerings in this location?" She did not answer immediately. When she finally did, she said, "I believe that your great-grandmother encountered something that scared her into compliance. I believe that your grandmother witnessed events that convinced her the arrangement was real. I believe that your grandfather maintained the offerings because his instinct for survival told him that stopping would be dangerous. I believe we continue because the cost of being wrong exceeds the cost of compliance. Whether the creatures exist as I understand animals to exist, whether they are intelligent in the way that humans are intelligent, whether they actually require the offerings, those are separate questions. The arrangement exists. I am not willing to be the person who breaks it. I stayed for a week and then returned to my life in the city. But something had shifted in me. I had met my mother's seriousness, had seen the way she approached the protocol with neither fanatic conviction nor complete dismissal, but with a kind of pragmatic acceptance. Over the following years, I found myself paying more attention to the family's history. I asked my grandmother to tell me everything she could remember about the encounters, the history, the reasoning behind the protocol. I began to read the journals that Eleanor and my mother had maintained. The more I learned, the more I began to understand something that my grandmother had been trying to tell me, something that exists only partially in words. The Cossatot Valley Agreement was not a quaint folk tradition. It was a negotiated boundary. It was a mutual understanding between two intelligent species about how to coexist without destroying each other. And it was fragile. It depended on continuing maintenance, on generational transmission of knowledge and commitment, on the willingness of each side to honor the terms even when the costs were high. My grandmother suffered her stroke in 1990. Over the following years, she slowly regained some ability to speak and to write, though both were labored and limited. I visited her as often as I could. During one visit in 1993, she was struggling to articulate something that was clearly urgent to her. She kept writing the same word over and over. Offerings, offerings, offerings. When I asked her what she was trying to tell me, she wrote slowly, with visible effort, "They will know. They will know when we stop." By 2008, my mother was aging rapidly. She was still living in the house, still maintaining the offerings, but the effort was becoming overwhelming. She was alone. The property was demanding. Her health was deteriorating. She asked me to help her decide whether to sell or to continue. The choice felt impossible. Selling meant leaving behind not just a house, but a family responsibility that went back more than a century. Maintaining it meant committing to a ritual that I still did not fully believe in, that was demanding more of my life than seemed reasonable. I proposed a compromise. I would spend time in the valley during hunting season. I would participate in maintaining the offerings, but I could not commit to living there permanently, could not make it the center of my life. My mother accepted this arrangement. It meant that the offerings would be maintained, though not with the same regularity that my grandmother and mother had sustained them. It meant the protocol would continue, but in attenuated form. Between 2008 and 2015, I maintained a reduced version of the offering schedule. I was able to make quarterly trips to the valley. I hunted when possible, left the designated portions at the offering sites, and maintained a record of when and what had been left. It was not as systematic as the historical pattern, but it was better than nothing. In late 2015, my mother passed away. She was 83 years old, and she died in the old house, which by then had become a repository for 9 decades of family history. I inherited the property along with the responsibility that came with it. I was in my 50s by that point, established in my career, committed to my family outside the valley, but suddenly positioned as the steward of knowledge and obligation that stretched back generations. The development actually began in 2019 with preliminary surveying and access road construction. My mother was still alive at that point, though she was aging rapidly and her health was declining. She asked me to drive with her to the development sites to see exactly what was happening. We drove to the location of the primary offering site, the one that had been maintained since the 1890s. The site was partially excavated, trees had been cut, the landscape was being transformed in ways that were irreversible. My mother did not cry or express anger. She just stood there and said, "They're breaking the agreement." And then, I wonder what it will mean when the creatures understand that the agreement has been broken. The decision to maintain the offerings became more complicated after my mother's death. I could not live in the valley full-time. I could not hunt regularly or maintain the same seasonal schedule, but I also could not simply stop. The psychological weight of 3 generations of women who had taken this responsibility seriously, who had lived in fear of what would happen if the offering ceased, created a pressure that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. I began to research. I looked for any accounts, historical or contemporary, of what happened when the offering protocols failed. My grandmother had alluded to incidents, to times when families had abandoned the protocol and had experienced retaliation. But the accounts were vague, oral, filtered through memory, and translated into a contemporary worldview that barely had space for them. I found one account in a collection of folklore transcriptions made by a graduate student in 1978. It described an incident that had allegedly occurred in the 1890s, when a logging crew working deep in the valley forest had begun removing timber from an area that was understood to be the creature's primary territory. The account claimed that within weeks the crew experienced a series of incidents: equipment failures, injuries that seemed to have no clear cause, animals fleeing the area, an atmosphere of constant threat. The crew abandoned the work. The account stated that the senior member of the crew, before he died, said that the forest had made clear that certain areas were not for human extraction. This account was labeled as folklore, as a story passed down rather than a documented historical fact. But it suggested a pattern. Humans who violated the protocol experienced consequences. I spent the next years in a state of anxious management. I made trips to the valley when I could afford to take time away from my life elsewhere. I left offerings in the designated sites. I did minimal work to maintain the property. I left the old house mostly closed, visiting only during brief periods. I maintained Eleanor's journal, my mother's journal, and my own supplementary records. But I was aware that I was not truly maintaining the protocol at the level it had been maintained. I was doing the minimum, going through the motions, hoping that minimal compliance was sufficient. The first incident occurred on October 15, 2022, on a property owned by the Hendricks family, the family that had maintained the southern offering site. The Hendricks family was away, visiting relatives in town. When they returned to their property in the evening, they found that their livestock fence had been damaged, not collapsed, not broken by simple weight or impact, but deliberately dismantled. Sections of fence were pulled away cleanly, the posts were not broken but removed from the ground, and the wire was arranged in patterns across the property. The damage appeared to have been done carefully, with intention, with a kind of deliberation that ruled out natural predation or accidental impact. The Hendricks family called the sheriff. The sheriff investigated, found no evidence of human activity, concluded that it was likely a bear, or possibly a cougar, recommended installing more secure fencing. But Sarah Hendricks, the woman who maintained the offering site, told me that she was certain it was a message. She said, "They're showing us that they can reach us. They're showing us that the boundary is breaking." Over the following weeks, incidents escalated. A family 2 properties north reported that trees on their property had been marked with deep parallel grooves, cuts that appeared to have been made with something sharp and powerful, cuts that resembled claw marks, but that were too deep, too deliberate, too symmetrical to be natural claw marks. Another family reported that their property had been visited overnight, that everything on the porch had been moved, that objects had been rearranged in patterns, that nothing was broken or stolen, but everything had been touched, everything had been moved. By December 2022, more than 12 separate incidents had been reported to county authorities. The sheriff's office investigated each one, found no clear evidence of human activity, concluded that the valley was experiencing an unusual influx of large predators, recommended that residents take precautions. But the residents of the valley, particularly those families that understood the protocol, understood that the incidents were not random predation, but deliberate communication. The most significant incident occurred on January 3, 2023. A property adjacent to one of the damaged offering sites reported that livestock had been killed, not consumed, not attacked in ways that suggested predation, but systematically killed. Sheep and goats had been killed with their necks broken or their bodies showing signs of extreme blunt force trauma. The animals were arranged in the pasture in patterns, not randomly scattered, but deliberately positioned. And around the dead animals, the ground had been marked with those same deep parallel grooves, those same claw marks that resembled nothing in the documented fauna of Arkansas. In late 2020, everything changed. I received a call from the realtor who manages the property assessment for the county. A development company from Bentonville had acquired land adjacent to the valley, land that had been held as national forest, but had recently been transferred to private ownership. The company's preliminary plans included expansion into the valley proper, clearing sections for resort development, creating access roads, establishing infrastructure. The project would fundamentally transform the valley. It would bring human presence into the deep forest areas. It would destroy the offering sites. It would make the maintenance of the protocol physically impossible. I contacted the company. I met with representatives, explained the cultural significance of the valley, asked if they would be willing to preserve certain areas. I was polite and completely ineffectual. The company had permits, had legal authority, had economic incentive. My objections were characterized as obstructionist. I began to contact the other families who had historical connection to the Valley Protocol. Most of them no longer lived in the area. Most of them had not participated in the offerings for decades. Many of them did not believe the protocol was real, but a few, the oldest members of families that had the deepest roots, expressed concern. One woman, named Sarah Hendricks, whose family had maintained an offering site since the 1890s, told me she was worried about what would happen when the protocol failed. She said her grandmother had told her that the creatures would not tolerate the destruction of their territory. They would make it clear that the agreement had been broken. By late 2021, it was clear that the development was going to proceed. The resort project was beginning construction. Access roads were being cut through areas that had been undisturbed for more than a century. Equipment was being brought in. Work was being done to clear and survey land for building. I went to the valley in early 2022. I needed to assess the damage, to see what had happened to the offering sites, to understand the scope of what had been lost. What I found was worse than I had anticipated. The primary offering site, the one along the creek bed that had been maintained since the 1890s, had been directly impacted by road construction. The site was now exposed, partially excavated, irretrievably damaged. The deep site, the location in the most remote forest area, where Eleanor had documented the first sighting, was still intact, but it was now accessible by construction road. The equipment was parking near it. The area was being surveyed. It was only a matter of time before that site would be destroyed as well. The only remaining intact offering site was the one that my great-grandfather had established on the Merrill property itself, about 200 yards from the house. It was still active, still protected by the property boundaries, but it was surrounded by development activity. The valley was being consumed. I left a final offering at that site. I prepared fresh elk meat, grain, salt, and I left it in the marked location as I had been trained to do. But I also left a note, something that violated every tradition that my family had maintained. I wrote, "The agreement is breaking. We are unable to maintain it. Forgive us." This was the end. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call. A family that lived on the south edge of the valley had experienced an incident at their property. Their livestock had been killed, not consumed, simply killed and left in the pasture. The deaths had happened overnight, and the family had found the animals in the morning, arranged in deliberate patterns, not randomly scattered. The family was frightened and had called the county sheriff, but the sheriff found no evidence of normal predation. No clear cause of death was immediately apparent. The official explanation was that an unauthorized predator, possibly a cougar or a rogue bear, had been in the area. But Sarah Hendricks, the woman who had expressed concern about the protocol failure, called me and said she was certain that this was a message. The creatures were making clear that the agreement had been violated. The protocol had failed. The consequences were beginning. Over the following months, there were additional incidents. Another property experienced damage to fencing and water systems, damage that appeared deliberate and that required effort to cause, but that seemed to serve no practical purpose. A family reported seeing large dark shapes moving through their property at night, shapes that their livestock refused to approach and that disappeared when confronted. A child claimed to have seen something at the edge of a clearing, something large and dark that had looked at her and then vanished. None of the incidents resulted in human injury. All of them appeared designed to communicate threat without delivering actual violence. I moved the manuscript that my grandmother had called the Cossatot Understanding to a secure location. I interviewed Sarah Hendricks and recorded her account of the incidents. I began to document what I could access of the family histories and the protocols that other Valley families had maintained. I was gathering this information because I understood that once the development was complete, once the Valley was transformed into a resort destination with human traffic and infrastructure, the remaining evidence of the protocol would be lost. In late 2022, the primary offering site was completely destroyed. The resort company had finished the access road. The site was excavated, the marked tree formation was cut down. The entire area was graded and prepared for construction. I stood at the location and looked at what had been erased. For the first time, I felt a genuine fear of what would come next, not intellectual concern, but physical fear, a sense that I had been present at the violation of a boundary and that there would be consequences. Nothing happened immediately. The development continued. The resort began to take physical form. But in the deep forest, on properties that remained undeveloped, families began to report unusual activity. The incidents increased in frequency and specificity. A family reported that offerings left out for their hunting dogs had been moved, arranged in patterns. Another family said that marks had appeared on their property, marks similar to those described in the historical accounts, parallel grooves in trees and on fence posts, marks that appeared deliberate and that appeared overnight. One evening in mid-2023, I received a communication that convinced me that whatever existed in the forest, whatever the creatures were, they had not abandoned the valley. I found a note on my car when I parked at the house. The note was written on paper that my family had used, paper from a notepad that my mother had left in the kitchen. The handwriting was crude, the letters formed with difficulty but clearly intentional. The note read, "Offerings continue or we reclaim." This was not animal behavior. This was intelligence, leaving a message, communicating a demand. The creatures had made clear what they wanted. They were not willing to accept the failure of the protocol. I am the last person who holds both the knowledge and the willingness to acknowledge it. When I am gone, unless someone else chooses to carry this story, it will become only folklore, a tale that nobody believes, a myth that belonged to an older, more superstitious time. But the creatures will not stop believing. The creatures will remember that the offering stopped, that the protocol was violated, that humans destroyed the boundary between the settled valley and the deep forest. And they will continue to respond according to whatever understanding they hold of justice and consequences. I have spent the past year in a state of active contradiction. I do not believe in these creatures in any way that my education and my rationality will accept. But I have evidence that something has responded to the violation of the protocol. Something has made clear that an agreement exists, that the agreement has been broken, and that consequences are pending. I have considered reporting what is happening to authorities, but to who exactly would I report it? That creatures are making threats based on a broken offering protocol? That my family made an agreement with forest beings more than a century ago, and now that agreement is collapsing? The official response would be dismissal. The practical response would be investigation, followed by exoneration of the development company and treatment of the incidents as unrelated animal activity. The development is continuing. The resort is expected to open in 2024. Once it opens, the valley will be accessible to tourists, to outsiders, to people with no understanding of the protocol and no respect for the boundaries. The creatures will have to decide how to respond to this fundamental transformation of their territory. And I have no idea what that response will look like. I am telling you this story not as a definitive statement, but as a warning and as a documentation. Something lives in the Cossatot River Valley. Something intelligent enough to communicate, to make agreements, to respond when those agreements are violated. Something capable of enforcing boundaries through means that we do not fully understand, but that are clearly not random animal behavior. And that something has made clear that the presence of humans in the valley, as long as the protocol was maintained, was tolerable. But the destruction of the protocol, the violation of the boundaries, the transformation of the valley for development and tourism is intolerable. The agreement is breaking. The creatures are making clear what that means. What comes next will be determined by how the creatures respond, and by whether anyone in the valley has the authority or willingness to restore the protocol before the consequences escalate beyond what can be managed. I am the last person who fully understands what the agreement means, what was maintained, what is being lost. I am 57 years old as I write this. I have lived most of my adult life outside the valley, in a world where the protocol does not exist, where the offerings are not maintained, where the creatures are dismissed as folklore. I have built a career, raised a family, integrated myself into a way of life that has no place for the kind of knowledge that my grandmother carried. But the knowledge persists in me despite my efforts to leave it behind. It sits in the background of my consciousness, a weight that I cannot articulate to anyone outside my family. A conviction that contradicts everything I have been educated to believe. The valley is being consumed. The resort is nearing completion. The roads have been cut through the deep forest. The offering sites have been destroyed. The agreements that were maintained through generations of sacrifice are being erased. And the creatures have made clear, through the incidents of 2022 and 2023, that they understand what is happening and that they are not willing to accept it passively. I do not know what will come next. I do not know if the creatures will escalate to direct violence, if they will abandon the valley entirely, if they will attempt some new form of negotiation or coexistence with the transformed landscape. What I know is that my family carried knowledge that stretched back further than written history, that maintained agreements that were more complex than modern consciousness can easily process, that recognized the valley as a shared space where two intelligences maintained a fragile coexistence. When I am gone, unless someone else chooses to carry this knowledge forward, it will become only folklore, a tale that nobody believes, a myth that belonged to an older, more superstitious time. But the creatures will not stop believing. The creatures will remember that the offering stopped, that the protocol was violated, that humans destroyed the boundary between the settled valley and the deep forest, and they will continue to respond according to whatever understanding they hold of justice and consequences. My family is selling the Merrill property. We have exhausted our ability to maintain it. The property will likely be incorporated into the resort development or sold to another developer. The offering site on our land, the one that remained intact as the other sites were destroyed, will be developed or built over or repurposed. The three-generation protocol will finally end. The Book of Enoch, the version that my grandmother read so carefully and marked so extensively, describes beings that came to establish treaties with humanity. It describes hybrids that were neither fully divine nor fully human, that existed in the liminal space between two worlds. It describes the creation of an agreement by which one species would respect the boundaries of another, by which coexistence was possible as long as both parties honored the terms. My grandmother believed that the creatures in the Cossatot River Valley were the descendants of those beings, that they represented an agreement that predated human civilization in the valley, that had been inherited by the logging families and had been maintained through cultural transmission and practical necessity. I did not believe this for most of my life. I treated it as folklore, as the residue of a more superstitious era, as something that my family did out of habit rather than genuine conviction. But standing in the valley now, watching the development consume the landscape, watching the offering sites be destroyed, finding notes left on my car that communicate demands I cannot ignore, I am beginning to believe that my grandmother may have been right. The agreement was real, the creatures were real, and the consequences of breaking the agreement will be real. I have spent the last year trying to document as much as I can, trying to preserve the knowledge before it is lost entirely. I have interviewed the remaining valley residents who remember the protocols. I have examined the family journals. I have visited the offering sites before they were destroyed. I have tried to create a record of what existed, what was maintained, what is being lost. But documentation is not the same as maintenance. A journal is not the same as an offering. Writing about the protocol is not the same as living within it. And I am aware, with a kind of deep certainty that I cannot fully explain, that the creatures understand the difference. They understand that someone has stopped coming to the forest with portions of the hunt. They understand that the pact is breaking, and they are making clear, through the incidents and the messages, that they will not accept the destruction of the agreement without response. My family made a choice, generations ago, to recognize the intelligence and autonomy of the creatures in the forest. We chose to establish a boundary, to respect their territory, to maintain a protocol that benefited both species. That choice shaped my family's entire history in the valley. It shaped how we lived, how we hunted, how we understood our place in a landscape that was not entirely ours. And it required a kind of sacrifice, a kind of discipline, a kind of attention that is increasingly rare in the modern world. Now, that choice is being undone. The boundary is being destroyed. The protocol is failing. And I am the last person who fully understands what that means, what was maintained, what is being lost. When I am gone, the knowledge dies with me, unless I commit to documenting it, preserving it, making it available for future generations who might need to understand what existed here, what was possible here, what should perhaps be restored if future people recognize the cost of breaking agreements that are older than civilization. Every household along the Cossatot River kept one rule for generations, and that rule has been broken. The creatures have made clear that they remember what was promised and what was lost. Now the valley will discover what happens when an agreement, maintained through centuries and through generations of sacrifice, finally fails. What I know is this: every household along the Cossatot River kept one rule for generations, and that rule was maintained through sacrifice and seriousness and genuine belief that breaking it would carry consequences. The rule was not just folklore or superstition. It was a compact, an agreement, a boundary that existed because both sides of that boundary understood what it meant to violate it. The creatures in the forest were not savage beasts. They were intelligent, they could communicate, they could remember, and they understood honor and betrayal as well as any human population. Now that boundary is being destroyed. The offerings have stopped, the protocol is failing, and the creatures have made clear, through years of patient messages, through carefully arranged demonstrations, through notes left in my car, and marks left on properties and livestock, killed in deliberate patterns, that they understand what has happened and that they are preparing a response. Whether that response will be negotiation or escalation, whether the creatures will attempt to restore the agreement, or whether they will abandon the strategy of restraint and simply reclaim their territory through force, I do not know. What I know is that something is coming to the Cossatot Valley, something that has been promised and that has been wronged. And the people who live there are about to discover what it means when the patience of an ancient intelligence finally ends.